All right, everyone. Welcome to Sorting Myself Out. My name is Ryan Holsapple. I'm here with James and Mercury. Welcome, guys. How you doing?
Doing good.
Merc?
Hello, all.
Obviously, a lot of you know that James has been on this podcast or on this YouTube channel before a couple times, and I reached out to him to see if he wanted to have a discussion about Carl Jung, because James has researched Carl Jung along with myself. And he said, yeah, of course I'd like to do that. And then Mercury wanted to just kind of join us and see what questions come up or comments come up for him. So we're going to dive right into that. Sound good, guys?
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
take it away.
Sweet. So the first thing that I guess we should do a brief kind of introduction to Jung. Jung was obviously one of the first pioneers of psychology, along with Freud, and then before that was William James, who was, technically speaking, the first real psychologist. But Jung and Freud split off, I don't know, what was it, around 1912, James, when they split off and they stopped really working together as colleagues. And Jung was Freud's crowned prince, so he was expected to take over the enterprise of Freudian psychology and kind of live that legacy forward. And Freud was very excited at the prospect of Jung doing that because he knew how brilliant Jung was. So it was definitely kind of a tragic separation between the two. And then Jung went on to create analytical psychology, and it kind of all came out of his experiences written about in his Red Book, which was published by Sonu Shamdasani in 2009. And that his entire psychology, the entire opus, was written around those deep experiences that he had going into his, what he called active imagination, where he experienced these elements of the unconscious. So I just want to open that up as kind of an overall introduction to Jung for those of you who aren't aware of who he is. And then a couple of the ideas that we wanted to discuss here today. One is the Anima and the self. There's a couple quotes about that I thought were really interesting. And then James had some interesting ideas about Wolfgang Pauli and Jung, who had these unique correspondence messages between each other about physics and psychology and kind of how they overlap. So where do you think we should start?
That's a good question. Maybe why don't we start with talking about maybe some of the stuff that you had about the anima and the self.
Awesome. So the anima is, I like, Jung thought of it as the feminine soul of a man, and then the animus would be the masculine soul of a woman. I think that is kind of the overall idea that people get from it, but I think it's a lot deeper than that. What I've been reading about is how he thought it was the life principle. So anima was the life energy of your being as a person. It was what kind of breathes force into your psyche and gives life to the complexes, the personality, and that can either have a face that can be perceived as positive or negative depending on how conscious you make it. But this really interesting quote that he had, which I really like, was that he was talking about the wise old man, and the wise old man is a symbol of the self, and the self is kind of the totality of who you are, all the elements of your psyche as one big mandala, as one big picture. And this quote is for the wise old man, who is an image of the self. He is the father of the soul, and yet the soul, in some miraculous manner, is also his virgin mother, for which reason he was called by the alchemists the first son of the mother. I just thought that was, when I read that, it just blew my mind, because obviously we know that the self, growing into yourself or becoming yourself in a Jungian sense, is individuation. And obviously what this is saying is that the soul is such a core component of this becoming yourself. But at the same time, the self is such a core component of getting in touch with your soul. So there's this weird kind of push and pull going on there. that struck a chord with me as something deeply true and paradoxical.
Mhm. Yeah. So there's a kind of a few things that brings up for me. I guess the first is that Jung saw the anima in the man and the animus in the woman, as the part of you that sort of connects you to the unconscious, the bridge between your conscious and the unconscious. Um, and I sort of feel that if you're going to integrate aspects of your unconscious into yourself or bring them up to consciousness, um, perhaps you could sort of see that as being born out of your interaction with the anima. So in that way, your anima is maybe the mother of things that come from the unconscious or can be seen in that manner.
Mm. I like that a lot. You got any thoughts about this so far, Merc?
So is the anima, because I remember hearing someone, I thought I heard someone at one point also refer to the anima as what you can interact with to connect to the collective unconscious. Does that go hand in hand with what you were saying, James?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's two elements to Jung. There's the personal, in his thinking, there's the personal unconscious, and then there's the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious, and this is Jung's ideas, and I will say that I don't necessarily use this language in my own thinking, but I want to do justice to his own ideas. So the personal unconscious consisted of all the suppressed and repressed material of your life, of your lifetime. So the personal unconscious are the Freudian id, so to speak. Okay, the collective unconscious is more. There's a phylogenetic component to it that can be read biologically, but there's also a immaterial, nebulous, protein component where these archetypes that constitute the psyche, the complexes of the psyche, are far-reaching throughout human history, and they have a breadth and depth that is bigger than any individual's lives. Now, he didn't have the advantage of genetic research, but obviously we know now that, in your genome, that's quite literally the case. Whether or not he didn't necessarily mean it that literally, but he still alluded to the physiological component. But we have to also keep in mind that to Jung, it wasn't purely physiological. There was a deeply, what he called, psychic component to it, where these archetypes had almost a life energy or an energy field of their own. Now, that's where it kind of gets into the metaphysical, and we can talk about Wolfgang Pauli and stuff later on. But yeah, it was very, very interesting thinking that he was developing.
And when it comes to how he was looking at the archetypes, as to whether that was just something within yourself or whether there was something metaphysical to it, is my understanding correct that his position on that actually seemed to have changed somewhat? That earlier on it seemed more that he was looking at it as a psychological phenomenon, and that later on he seemed to see the possibility that there was something to it outside of ourselves in that metaphysical way?
So my understanding of it is that at first he saw it purely as like a conceptual framework, or I guess structures that maybe couldn't be fully understood, structures that govern the psyche. But and as far as I know, he tried to stick to that. I think he was maybe open to the possibility of more, I guess, deeper metaphysical realities, but I don't think he made any hard claims.
Yeah,
according to that.
That's right, because he was very influenced by Kant, and so he had this idea of a priorism, where regardless of what's true external to yourself, what you have is the phenomenological fact of what you experience as a human being. And so to Jung, it's not a matter of whether or not God exists, empirically speaking, for most of his career. Okay, he might have been more open to those ideas at some point professionally, but he told that line that what we can say is that God's a reality of the psyche, that God, that these archetypes are the part of the way that we experience life. And so for him to be psychological is to look at that side of the coin, the inside of the psyche, rather than empirical reality. And so that's also a really interesting thought too, James, because he was doing something a lot different than what all the logical positivists and the rationalists were developing. And Freud somewhat could fall into that category. He had that rationalistic side to him, although he was a little more open to mythological ideas. He even used myth in his psychology a little bit. But anyways, so yeah, he had that Kantian distinction in his psychology.
So if someone was just fresh getting into Jung, then would they find his material equal, whether they were an atheist or a believer, or would one of those be more challenged than the other? Or is it kind of like the way Peterson can toe the line, and you could be either a believer or a complete atheist and look at his framework?
So I think from an atheist perspective, if you read the right book first, where he sort of upfront explains that he's not making any metaphysical claims, what he's doing is he's just taking a bunch of data from from case studies from his patients, etc., and developing a conceptual framework to understand what is happening, then I think there shouldn't be any problem either for believers or atheists. But I think maybe a problem for the believer might come in when he tries to discuss, maybe when he tries to use psychological criticisms of, say, Christian dogma, which is something he certainly did. But as far as like metaphysical claims or anything like that, he tried, at least for some of his writing, he tried to be clear that he wasn't making any statements about that.
Yeah, but I think he made a lot of people unhappy. I mean,
yeah, there's
a reason why he's not widely accepted in universities, and it's changing now a little bit. But he kind of turned off the Christians. I think the priest who spoke at his funeral called him a heretic, which is pretty funny. I've heard that. I don't remember where, but I'm pretty sure that's a verifiable thing. And then he was also accused of being a mystic by more logically oriented people, so he was in this weird middle space, which ironically enough, in Jungian psychology, the middle space is the space of soul. That's Hillman would call the metaxy, the middle ground that balances. So he was in this soulful position to unify opposites, literally unify religion and science. He was quite a visionary in that sense. However, there's never a crowd on the leading edge, as we all know. So he did not. I mean, I think he really upset a lot of people, and yeah. But I do think that you're right, James. That if you're an atheist and if you picked up the right book, you could see where he was going, and especially because he maintains that Kantian distinction. We're not talking about anything out there. We're just talking about how psychic life happens within you, within each human being. Now, where people get a little bit suspicious with Jung is the archetypes, the idea that they can possess you, or any conception that they're floating around to jump into you somehow, like ghosts. I mean, I think these are caricatures of his actual thinking, but it's easy to misinterpret it at a surface level that's what he's saying. But that's why I like personally to look at it, establish a biological evolutionary perspective, that we have these deep biological neural circuits that have been passed down for millennia, and those have a very powerful emotional affect in our lives, and they're much bigger than what is in our personal lives. We come into the world with them. But I have to be fair again to Jung, that I think that he would still say that that's a form of reductionism to leave it there. I think, wouldn't you say, James, that he would go beyond that, right?
Yeah. So I would agree with that, because he takes psychic facts as facts in a serious sense, like psychic reality. So to him, it's not just biology or biological substrate, as far as I can tell. So
yeah. I think he was, again, interdisciplinary, embodying that middle ground, because I've found several quotes where he talks about the phylogenetic aspect of the psyche, as well as how each human inherits a unique brain, and because they inherit a unique brain, obviously each human's going to be unique with unique predispositions and unique coping styles. I mean, he was ahead of his time in so many different ways, it's not even funny. So, yeah, I've been particularly interested in the biological side of archetypes for a while, and however, also I'm open to the metaphysical side and also just the psychological side as a phenomenological fact. I mean, I like this thing that comes out of Ken Wilber and Tim Freak's thinking of emergentism, that in Gestalt therapy, it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's like,
Right.
whatever this human being creates as a psychic reality, it's greater than whatever we drill down to at the cellular structure. It's creating its own world. And that's how we experience it. We don't experience life as a neuron or a cell in any capacity. We experience life as a human being. And so we have narrative structure and mythological structure, and there's all these complex ways in which we make sense of our reality and relate to it. And so I think Jung was right on top of that, and he understood that this emergent existence has an archetypal basis, and that we are driven by powers beyond our comprehension. We're driven by forces that we don't really always understand, and these always typically come by way of powerful emotional affect, or what he calls psychological complexes that are for example, getting angry, getting sad, getting inspired. It can be anything. Inspired, happy. I mean, we're always in a complex. There's no not being in a complex, really. But these powerful emotional affects are carrying a weight that's greater than our individual selves. Would you say that that's right, James? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. In most of my reading, I think that typically when people talk about complexes in I guess a psychoanalytic context, they typically have a negative connotation, or a complex is something that is like it's a conceptualization of something that is either bothering you or wrong with you, and something you want to resolve or get rid of. But I don't know would you happen to know if that's how people usually?
I think you're right that would be like the mainstream assumption. But yeah, no, complexes could be, I'm excited to do this podcast right now, or I'm pumped to go to work tomorrow morning because I'm working on this awesome project, or I just fell in love. That's a complex. A complex is life, where life is made, like we're always to Jung, possessed by some or another bigger piece of life that is animating us. Anima, animate. It's bringing life to us. It's bringing soul to us. And if we're conscious of it, then the anima takes on the figure of the beautiful life-giving goddess. And to Jung, if we're not conscious of it, if we're not paying the proper attention to the psyche, then it turns a negative face towards us and creates what he calls shadow dynamics, where you get moody, or, like earlier today, I got like really moody. I was in the kitchen and my girlfriend and I, who have lived together for a while, she was doing something, and I really was worried that the oven knob was going to pop off. And I was just like, don't do that. The oven knob's going to pop off. I just popped it off yesterday. Please don't do that. And I was like freaking out. And she's like, why are you getting so upset? And I was like, oh my God, I'm in a complex. I'm being animated by, and it's, again, to me, it's not helpful to think of it as a ghost that's coming into you. I really think of it as a circuit. It's a neurological circuit. It's also it's a sub-personality. It's an archetype, but it's not some abstract, out there. It doesn't have to be a mystical, in my opinion, James. It doesn't have to be a mystical thing. It's just a matter of powerful affect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess one way that I kind of think of, I like how you describe that. One way I kind of think about it as, once you're in a given I guess, situation or configuration of things around you. You could think about a complex or an archetype as a disposition to act in a particular way, given a set of circumstances. So, getting angry, like, if I'm going to get hit by a car or about to get hit by a car and I step out of the way, I'm going to get angry or something like that.
Yes. That's beautifully said. A disposition to act in a certain way. And again, I just want to, just because I'm passionate about this particular area, again, we now have loads of research showing that we all have unique dispositions to act in particular ways, but we're also human, so we share, we share 99% of the same genome, so we also have similar dispositions. So that, quite literally, we share a lot of archetypal ways of being with each other. But I love the way you said that. It's a proclivity. It's a priori. It's it comes with. It's already there in the situation. It's a coping style. It's a way of managing, a way of dealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another interesting aspect of this that just popped into my head is that there's sort of, I think maybe, and I want to hear what you think about this, but there's certain scales of time for which these different dispositions will play themselves out. So, like, you could say a day, a minute, or like a year. And I wonder if the archetypes tend to talk about dispositions for behavior over long periods of time, or as opposed to like just minute by minute.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Because I guess for one thing, it seems to me that a story like the hero's journey, that's something that you could apply to yourself as you're trying to work towards a specific goal over a long period of time. But I guess at the same time, you could also apply that to as like just a daily thing. Every day you're living the hero's journey in some sense.
Yeah, well, I think it's true on the micro and macro level. Whatever myth that you're embodying, I think has multiple scales to it for sure. I think that would be, it would be like concentric rings moving outward and continuing a ripple effect. That would make sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that visualization, the concentric rings.
Yeah, for sure. Any thoughts, Merc?
One thing, when you were saying that like it doesn't need to be thought of as mystical to be real, because you're saying that we can ground this in science, in that it's actually present in our like DNA. It's present in the structure of our brains, and that our body itself contains this information, and that we can now understand this due to like genetic science in a way that Carl Jung couldn't, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I would get a bit of pushback on that from some of my colleagues, and then also some of my professors, because there's a great psychologist named James Hillman who founded archetypal psychology. I really like his work. I don't agree with a little portion of what he says, because he kind of throws science out the window. It's like Jung never did that. Jung never did that. He was very much striving to fit into science. He was very multi and interdisciplinary. James Hillman calls himself an imaginal reductionist. So he thinks the imagination is kind of the creme de la creme of psychological life. And he has a beautiful way of saying, listen, we have to live life in a way that is not constrained by objectivism and subjectivism, and thinking that the world is made up of this kind of like Cartesian dualism where we're always, up against what's, me and my personal experience versus the real world. And so there's so much value to the way of thinking that Hillman brought in. So a lot of post-Jungian thinkers have really adopted that Hillmanian style. I don't go that far. I think that you can still be a poet and a scientist at the same time. You do not need to be one or the other. Now, when you're writing poetry, do you want to like measure everything you're writing and hyper constrain it? Absolutely not, because then you're going to suffocate your soul. And so there is a way in which scientific thinking can suffocate the soul, and I think Jung understood that, and that we have to let the imagination wander, we have to let our soul breathe, and we can't always try to cram things into scientific analysis. So that's a critique that would be leveled against some of the things I'm saying. But I do think, yes, Mercury, we can ground a lot of this in evolutionary biology. And I'm not saying that we're going to say that's the neurological circuit for the hero's journey, or that's the neurological circuit for the archetype of the warrior. Now, we might get some of those genetic and neurological profiles established over time, and they've started the work on those types of things. But it's not. It's just like we wouldn't treat an psychology or an archetype in a reductional way. We don't have to treat the body that way. The body's very complex. There's multiple parts always working at once. It's not one circuit or one cell. It's just part of the information that goes into our psychological life. So I do my best to maintain a scientific position without reducing it to just that, because I think it's important that the imagination does have room to breathe, and we can feel that there's this grand aspect to the universe, and that we can connect to powers greater than ourselves. And I think that if we go too far in the reductionist direction, then we kind of risk that a little bit. But I think that people have overcompensated. I think James Hillman overcompensated to make a point. And you know how Mercury, you say a lot of times that sometimes to make a really good point, you have to exaggerate?
Yeah.
I think Hillman did that. I think he made some big exaggerations, and I think they were for a good reason. I think they helped his purpose. So.
And I know that none of what you were saying, were you saying like it's reduced to just this? You were just saying that there's the scientific and genetic component to it.
Yes.
And I think it's clear our DNA carries all kinds of information, and it's got to be an aspect of it. Like, I mean, you can see it in the Canada goose. It's got the archetype built into its genetics to know where to go. Like, information is obviously stored in our bodies physically and involved.
Mary Louise von France, who was a great Jungian, she was a close friend of Jung's and worked with Jung, and she wrote a lot of books with Jung's approval as kind of a representative of his thinking. And one of the things she said, if you go up to a brooding chicken, that's on top of her eggs or whatever, you'll see that there's a conflict between the mother and the flight archetype, the flight pattern within her biology. And the mother is going to want to stay there, and you can see depending on which instinct is stronger, and again, this is subperson, what part of you is stronger in that moment. If the mother is stronger, then she'll stay there shaking on the egg as you approach her and won't move. But if the flight pattern wins, just depends on the chicken, the circumstance, whatever, then the egg gets abandoned. I thought that was a beautiful way of articulating kind of the strong force of these things.
Oh, right. The one point I wanted to make, though, was that as opposed to the new scientific discoveries, taking away, for the people who want to look at it from the mystical angle, to me, it seems actually to be reinforcing it. All of this genetic science, if you tried to explain that to somebody from the past who doesn't have our idea of science, that would sound like mysticism. To say that this is encoded in the very nature of your body, it's passed from mother and father and from all your genetic ancestors, and it's actually encoded inside you in this miraculous dimension that's beyond our understanding. It's the DNA is too small. We only understand it through science. And I don't think that takes away the mysticism of it. To me, I've gotten to a point where I'm confused how people are finding that science is demystifying, whereas I find that's all incredibly mystical. That information is.
People are still responding to science as if it's Richard Dawkins from the 80s, and it's not. I mean, they've all moved on. You know what I mean? It's not like that anymore.
And what I like about what you guys are saying about Jung, when you were saying how, some people didn't like him who were believers, he was called a heretic and whatnot. What I get from that is just that he was trying to be brutally honest, that he wasn't worried about stepping on toes in either direction, the scientific perspective or the religious, that he was just trying to be absolutely brutally honest about the only thing he truly has access to, which is his experience, the phenomenological aspect of it, and that to be brutally honest requires not worrying about being a heretic.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Can be seen like as a profoundly Christian thing to do still, to step on Christian dogma for the sake of adherence to the great truth that you have limited perspective to, like, to me, fits in very nicely. But anyway, I don't want to derail. I want to let you guys get back to whatever directions you wanted this to go originally.
Yeah, no, there is no derailing. So.
Yeah, no. So what that brought up for me is that it wasn't like Jung didn't just do that in order to make sense of his experience, like, do whatever made him a heretic. But he was also doing it so that he could actually help people in ways that maybe Christianity or just looking at everything from a scientific lens couldn't. So I think there's that aspect to it as well.
Yes. Yeah, and he also had this great line, James. I forget where I read this, one of his collective works.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get a client to go back to church, and that will be a sufficient treatment for their psychological ailment, then sometimes that's the best thing you can do, and don't bother with poking the bear. I mean, just like,
right.
if like he was very practical. It was like he's trying to solve clinical issues with people who are suffering, and if those people if their problem would be solved by simply going back and participating in the collective of a church community, getting the God instinct met, getting the community instinct met, getting all those meaningful ways that we have to be encountered. He didn't like argue that, oh, this is not a deep enough analysis, or you're not philosophically understanding life enough. Like, he was not arrogant about it. He was like, if that was the solution, that was the solution. He also helped Bill Wilson create Alcoholics Anonymous. It was, he was very pragmatic about what people can do to enhance their lives. So Jung was not by any means just an abstract thinker that had no practical utility. I mean, he was an expert clinician, and he was all about helping people live a good life. And if that meant simplifying, then fine. If that means complexifying, then fine.
Mm-hmm.
What else, James? Let's keep it rolling here.
Yeah. So I guess maybe one thing that I was thinking about a little bit with the concept of the anima as the mother of the self, maybe to bring it back to the very beginning of what we were talking about. I think it's interesting how this, at least in some ways, lines up with, I guess, Christian symbolism, because you very often see, so you have God the Father, and then you have Mary, and Mary is the mother of Jesus, but Jesus is also God, or the image of God on earth. Something like, there's this almost this circular identification, very similar to what you were talking about. This
because Jesus would be the self, and then the Virgin Mother would be the Anima, and then Jesus would also be, ironically, God the Father, who's the father of the Anima. So it's like it's this weird, it's this very interesting. When I read that, man, I still haven't fully been able to flesh out the implications of it, but I got the chills, because that's one of those paradoxes that feels so alive and jolting. It was just a beautiful moment to find. And that's in the collective Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, Volume 9, Part 1. Yeah. Yeah. So, what do you think, though? How could we push that idea to further articulate and understand what he's saying there, because it's got the poetic essence of truth to it, but I think it needs a little more articulation to really understand it, what that means.
Yeah, so I think if we understand the anima to be the thing that connects you to the unconscious, or your unconscious, I think that in order to manifest the self, what this means is you need to, or if you're going to take an active part in manifesting the self, it seems like you almost need to take an active part in engaging with understanding your own subpersonalities and how you react, I guess, in an unconscious manner to various situations, really watching yourself. And I think this is also related to maybe creativity in some ways, because I guess just because creativity, a lot of people think about it as just things just sort of welling up from your unconscious. And if the anima is that which connects you to your unconscious, then developing something like a relationship with it seems to be a way to maybe help yourself along in some sort of creative process. I mean, you see these sorts of things with writers and painters all the time. At least, so Jung, in one of his collected works, I read he did an essay on Picasso, and Picasso apparently had a bunch of paintings where he showed both dark and light feminine figures, and so this was supposed to somehow represent, at least from a psychological perspective, his interaction with bringing things into consciousness.
Yeah, I love that creativity. I mean, I think a Jungian psychology is a creative psychology. I mean, the whole approach to the soul it requires these psychological, I don't know if they're leaps of faith. I mean, Jung didn't even like the word faith, but this deep knowing, this ability to deal with ambivalence and to traverse the unknown and to track the different patterns of meaning. I mean, it's such a cornerstone of his thinking, the whole notion of creativity. After all, he's basing a lot of his theory on mythology and the whole idea of archetypes, which isn't interesting because not everybody feels creative, right? But that doesn't mean you can't access this soul that we're talking about, this deeper sense of connection to the psyche and all the different parts of who you are. It reminds me of the line from Corinthians 13:12. I'm going to pull it up. First we shall see lightly, then we shall see... First we shall see dimly, then we shall see more lightly, or something. Here, I'm going to read it. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as I also am known. There's something about that kind of reminds me of this self-exploration that we're talking about. This, and Jung also talked a lot about the importance that an archetype remains a little bit ambivalent. Because if we take it too much into conscious understanding and we over-define it, there's something about the ambivalence and the lack of definition where it's just on the it's like at dusk, right? There's something about dusk that just brings the landscape to life. It's like half in the light, half in the dark. It's that same principle with dealing with, it's like having this loose, not too tight perspective towards the psyche and being flexible and watching things as they come up. That to me seems like a really big piece of what we're talking about here.
Could that be that, okay, so say you're encountering an archetype and interacting with it because You're searching for that deeper knowledge from the unknown. Is the thing that if you define it tightly, like if you explore a bit of the unknown, then define it completely, you're then encapsulating it into the unknown. So it's like taking a piece of the unknown, make it known, bring it into the known. Now it's no longer a connection to the unknown.
Right.
But if you don't fully define it, so it's half understood, half unknown, it still maintains the connection to the unknown.
Right.
Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, yeah, and he said
Yeah, absolutely.
Didn't he say in the Red Book, James, the highest meaning is a combination between supreme meaning and supreme nonsense?
Yeah, I vaguely remember something like that. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So
and for me, it also just reminds of Lao Tzu saying that the Tao which can be named is not the Tao.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Or the imperative that, the true, there is no true name of God, that idea of a God that can't be named.
Yes. It's the unknown. And again, he said I think I wrote this in our notes, but he said the unconscious is the unknown as such. That's it. It was just period. Which I thought was kind of a really succinct statement that has a lot of implications. So anything that's in that unknown territory, and then when we bring that dim light, first we shall see dimly, then we shall see brightly. When we bring that, it's like expanding that territory within the psyche and bringing more understanding to what's going on, what's happening here, but maintaining that soulful sense of poeticism, that mythopoetic imagination that allows you to engage that archetype without bringing it too far into the realm of rationality, where you try to make it a puppet of your logos or your everyday understanding of life, where that there's something about the archetypes that they need to be treated as their own force with their own agency, right? Like almost as if they're their own person. These are the peoples of the psyche, as Jung would say, the little people of the psyche, or Hillman would often talk about that. And so whatever part of me is engaging those other parts that are on the periphery doesn't necessarily mean that part of me owns those or somehow gets to say that this is what this means or give it an ultimate definition. And so I think that's the kind of humility that we have to approach ourselves with. And I think what Jung and Hillman would call kind of a dethroning of the ego that happens through this process, where these other forces have more room to constellate in the individuation, and there's less of a sense of however you've been used to holding yourself. It kind of gets abandoned into the new horizon that you're stepping into. Would you say that's how would you explain that, James? Is that making sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm not sure if I could explain it better than you.
No, don't say that, James. You're brilliant. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Don't ever. I don't ever want to hear those words come out of your mouth again.
So I was actually thinking back about a little bit about what Mercury said about the archetype being partially defined.
Yeah.
And I think that so I read this in these the Pauli Jung letters. There's Pauli wrote about a couple of dreams that he had, and in a couple of the dreams he has this figure of a woman who he sort of recognizes and familiar and is nice, sort of the light side of the anima. And then there's another woman he meets in another dream who is dark and surrounded by strangers and everything. And so what that signifies to me is that, or what Jung said that this means is, he is engaged with the anima, but the dark part of the anima and the strangers represent things in the unconscious that he hasn't assimilated into his consciousness yet. So I guess that's an example of what Mercury was talking about an archetype being partially defined or partially understood in your conscious life. Like you can see this reflected in dreams, I think.
What does that bring up with you, Mercury?
That a lot of that is how I interact with things magically as well. There's an element to it all making sense and it all being nonsense, and an element of I know my angel in one sense, and in another it's completely unknown. And that the way I've treated that was whether or not my angel's an autonomous angel, like whether or not that's an entity, treating it as though it is gets me the best interaction with whatever the fuck I'm doing. And whether that's just something in my head or an interaction. And so I wonder, did Jung apply the same thing when he was doing his active imagination? Did he apply the same thing to the subpersonalities or archetypes that he was interacting with when he was in his meditative state of not worrying about defining whether or not it's aware on its own, but that you treat it like it is? And so if it's upset in some way, you treat that like something that is really suffering, regardless of whether it's real outside of you or not. That the best way to interact is to treat it that way?
Yes. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And there's well, again, like going back to the Kantian thing, it's just that he would treat it. I think Jung, who he was at, like his actual heart of hearts, was not fully publicized. Okay, so I think he might have maintained a professional persona for the sake of wanting to maintain a scientific reputation, and there was he kind of felt like he had to, from all I can read into it, kind of felt like he had, and I could be wrong, had to maintain a reputation because already what he was doing was so out there. So who knows what if you were with Jung behind closed doors and, off air type of talking with him, who knows what he would actually say. But I think, yes, he would just say, listen, we can't say what's the external reality, absolutely, but we do treat it as if it's real. And I actually heard a Jungian say recently that he said literally, quote unquote, and this isn't meant to be offensive. I didn't necessarily agree with it or disagree with it, but he said Jung would have thought to be an atheist is to be stupid. That he would have thought like to not treat the psyche religiously is such an error of epic proportions that it's like it's a fallacious thing. It's not. Now, I don't know. I've never seen where Jung, I don't know if he said that actually, but somebody said that was kind of Jung's opinion. And I've read quite a bit of Jung, but obviously there's always more and more and more and more that more people have read. So, but I don't think it means that you can't have atheistic intuitions about the nature of reality, but that if you're not willing to treat the psyche in a somewhat religious sense, meaning in a ritualistic sense, in a sense that you're bringing to it this reverence, this awe, this humility, this kind of religious devotion to your psychic life. If you're not doing that to Jung, that's insufficient. That's not that's not going to be okay. And I think he was also, in some sense, responding to Nietzsche's God is Dead work on that end as well, responding as if, we have to revive that sense of God within us. So, and I don't know if it has to be the word religious. Maybe spiritual is a better word, because religion has a connotation that makes it feel like you have to adhere to some dogma. But I think, what do you think, James? Am I representing his ideas well, or what am I missing here?
So I think Jung seemed like he was very much not for dogma, although I think he understood why it came about. But he seemed much more about each person individually going through these experiences. And so, I mean, for him, it was, writing things down in the red book and making those paintings and doing the active imagination and that sort of stuff. And he would do this with many of his patients. And so and the other thing is, I think he didn't want to, I think the reason why he didn't like the, I guess, atheistic approach is because effectively what that means is the parts of the psyche that are involved with the religious life sort of go unconscious. And then this is how you get things like possession by some political ideology or something like that.
Correct.
These
exactly
crippled religions, I believe he called them. Yeah.
Yes, he did say that. He kind of predicted that if you don't treat your psyche in a sufficient manner, then it's just, if you deny the religious aspect of who you are, then you're going to fall prey to these other ideological, like you might become a super serious postmodernist, or you might be, you might take yourself religiously serious in another area of your life if you're not taking your inner life serious enough. If you don't treat your soul as something really deeply important, and you don't act as if these things are important, then yeah, I think it's a dangerous territory that he was outlining. And I think in some sense he thought that was kind of what was responsible for the world wars.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question, because now that you brought it around to how basically ignoring the anima leaves you very vulnerable to ideological possession. And Peterson has a lot of work around Jung. I'm noticing that his conflict with ideological possession started surrounding transgenderism. And not from the perspective of the individual, perhaps, but is there something, do you think, archetypically to that so much focus recently got put on transgenderism? And do you think that idea has anything to do with, it seems to be coming out of an area where there's a lot of ideological possession, and the idea of just abandoning what you are and becoming the animal is what pushed Peterson up. I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Are you talking about the individuals who identify as transgender, or do you? Yeah,
no, I'm not asking about what you think's happening there, because
okay,
I don't.
You're talking about the political.
Why did the collective unconscious really focus in there on? Because you could look at it from this perspective as switching to your anima, or switching to the rather than integrating it. Trying to identify totally as it. I'm just wondering if that brought anything up for you guys.
It's really interesting. What that brought up.
That's an interesting.
Go ahead, James.
That's an interesting idea. I actually don't know, because when I haven't thought that much about the Peterson political stuff, but it seems to me that it was kind of like he was trying to point out, I guess, some sort of ideological possession, and maybe you could conceptualize that as something like resistance to bringing something to consciousness, or resistance to being, becoming conscious of something. But I'm not exactly sure. That's a really interesting idea, though.
Yeah, it is an interesting idea. First of all, the individual phenomena, we'll put that aside. Obviously, that's I think that's almost totally separate. Whether or not someone individually feels inclined towards another sex than they were biologically born as, or anything like that. That's I think that's a real issue that people deal with.
Yeah, and I just want to say that was the only reason I set that aside. Is I think
Right.
that's different than the societal phenomenon,
Right.
and not that it's unimportant, but just that.
Right.
But that what we're going to comment on about societally would have nothing to do with any individual, because I have no idea about any individual's experience. And it's not that that's not worth talking about. It's just,
Yeah.
we have no one here like that.
Well, it is interesting. Why did it capture so many people's attention? First of all, it's at a time where people are looking to protect victims, right? Ideologically speaking, we're at a political time where people are looking for minority communities to use as a part of their campaign for world transformation, or whatever you would call it. So I think that they became quickly a good catalyst for that cause, right? So there's a convenience aspect to it there, I think, for people who were on that mission. And then I think from a Peterson perspective, what he was saying was that you can just multiply victimhood, endlessly until there's just everybody's oppressed and there is no way to measure these things. And that was at least one of his more salient points. And then what really struck me about what you said is this whole idea of this liminal space, this soul space. It really reminds me of this whole symbolic transgender, this kind of middle ground that we've been talking about in this conversation. And it's sometimes I think the psyche projects outside something also deeply needed within, right? That's a common thing that we do. So it could be a cry out for soul. It could be a cry out for touching that liminality within oneself, that deep sense of connection and kind of loose and dancing harmonious part of ourselves that's not rigidly confined. And I think our whole society is starving for soul, to be honest. I think we're starving for meaning. We're starving for connection, and we're looking for whatever we can find in a lot of us. And so, yeah, that could be a part of it.
Yeah, maybe just as we have this overabundance of intellectual information, and we have such a complex surface society, and with the meaning crisis, and maybe somebody who's desperately lacking a connection to their own deeper self, and therefore have this longing for their own anima that they're not even aware of, that when they see the issue of transgender come up, that they would become very defensive of that, because it's an emotional response to their own longing for that deep connection with their own anima, that they're like, for fuck's sakes, let that person be their anima.
Right.
Like very.
Right.
And one thing I found, because Peterson will also say that like the SJW phenomenon is a sign of like how compassion can be a problem, too much of it. But what I find with that is that it reminds me of, was it called the Gini coefficient, where he said it wasn't the overall level of wealth that measured violence in a society, it was the disparity. Is that the Gini coefficient?
I'm not
whatever
sure.
it was called.
I'm not
He
sure.
said the problem with like violence and crime is when there's too large a gap between the richest and poorest, and it's not the overall level. And I kind of think it's the same thing with compassion. The problem isn't you have too much compassion for these marginalized groups, it's that you only have it for them and none for anyone else. And so it's like a Gini coefficient. It's the further out of whack your compassion is for one group and another, it becomes a problem. Whereas you could have infinite compassion for if it's for all of them equally, and it won't result in conflict.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really interesting take.
All right, but let's loop back around to Jung now. What's something else you guys had planned to discuss?
Wow. Well, what do you think, James?
Let's see. looking at some notes that I had. Oh yeah, so one thing that I was reading about in the Jung and Pauli letters is that there's a lot of really interesting, I guess, analogies between physics and psychology. And Jung and Pauli were kind of talking back and forth, trying to approach or attack this sort of mind-brain problem. And you know, whether they actually solved it or not, I think is I don't have to have sufficient expertise to say. But the one in particular, one interesting thing that I thought was that this notion of probabilities. So in quantum physics, things are described probabilistically in the sense that you can't necessarily, if you make a measurement of a system, and if you have identical systems and you measure each of them, you won't necessarily get the same measurement, but you'll get a probability distribution of measurements. And so at the quantum level, materials are probabilistic in that sense. And what's interesting is that Jung was saying that he kind of thinks about archetypes in the same manner. So what the way I was thinking this translates is that if you have a single individual, you don't necessarily know the degree to which they will act out an archetype. But if you have many individuals and you try and see in what way they all act out the archetype, there'll be something like a probability distribution. So, and I guess this goes back to what we were talking about earlier as an archetype as like a propensity to act in a certain manner. And so I was kind of thinking, I think that Jung was kind of thinking of an archetype as if a population is put in a given situation, then each person will act slightly different in this situation, but the archetype is sort of like the likelihood with which each person will act in that situation. Does that kind of make sense?
I'd heard somewhere where they were doing studies on the way people interact, like socially, and they found that it's really vague. But there was something like put into groups of 7, you'd get sort of 7 types come out. Like you'd get the alpha leader of the group, you'd get the beta, you'd get the joker who doesn't take it seriously. But what they found was you get those 7. It's like, say you did a bunch of them and then you take all the leaders out, put the 7 leaders into a group, they also fall into those 7. So one leader will remain the leader in that group, but the others will all fall into the other patterns, which I wish I could remember what scientist I heard talking about.
Did they document?
Sounds like, what was that?
Did they document research? Like, did they measure these things, or was it anecdotal?
Well, it was like putting groups together and giving them whatever kind of task and observing who fell into which social roles.
Yeah. And
then they'd pull people out, put them into different groups. But the phenomenon came, like you were saying, James, was that in every group you would get these 7 types. But when you took that group of 7 leaders, it's still only one was going to arise. When you put them into a different group, only one person's a leader, and somebody who was a leader in a different group becomes the joker in this group, or becomes the beta, or what, I forget all of the categories. I just have the vaguest memory of hearing about it. But
the problem I have with that is it's a blank slate idea. It doesn't assume the a priori of personality of the individual at hand. You know what I mean? It assumes that these archetypes are now free floating and the individuals are the puppets, and then that would take away the whole aspect of human uniqueness that has been validated. So that, to me, that's not my favorite part of Jung's thinking. The nomothetic kind of grouping people together and trying to predict behavior on that. I mean, maybe that's not what he's actually saying, but that I always push back against that. And that's obviously because of my training with Strachan. I mean, he's an individualist to the core, but
but still an individual. is different under different circumstances.
Yes, but that to me is because
way.
everything is attraction and connection. So every circumstance is going to bring out a different part of who I am. But I wouldn't say that if I went into a bar, that I was going to be, possessed by a certain archetype, because unless it was already a part of who I am.
It's still a part of who you are, but I can see strongly how the circumstance would change that. So, for instance, because I feel like the archetypes within us respond to the situation. And so, placed with a group of 6 other people where we're given a problem to solve, if my inner archetype recognizes I'm the best leader for the group, it'll step forward. And everyone else's archetype of that will step back.
But whereas what if somebody doesn't have a leader? That's where it all falls apart. Is what if someone...
that person you're imagining without a leader, put them with people with even less of a leader. So put them with 6 3-year-olds, and they'll become the leader. Do you get what I mean? So I don't think even if they have so little of the leader, that it wouldn't be there in any adult circumstance. Put them with 6 vegetables, brainless people, and the leader will come out if there's a problem.
Maybe.
But also, like, my leader, if in the group I recognize that someone else is better suited to that, I could see that it just wouldn't step forward. And I wouldn't feel like I was consciously turning down taking over leadership. It would just be a response to the situation.
Yeah, I just don't agree that everybody has... I don't think that would hold up, that everybody would be a leader under that circumstance.
And I don't think the findings, like, I'm sure there was all kinds of exceptions and whatnot, but that overall the pattern was present.
Right. Yeah. Well, I certainly agree that we're all human and we all have shared proclivities to some extent. But I don't think that they're 100% universal, and I don't think everybody has a leader, and I don't think everybody has a joker. So I don't think we're all made up of the same archetypes, to be honest. And maybe we can relate to them to greater or lesser degrees. I mean, maybe everybody has somewhat of a degree of sense of humor. So everybody potentially, maybe there actually might be people out there who don't have a sense of humor, actually, and I'm sure that there are. So, but the point is that there's degrees of these things that we have within us, but I just don't think that they're universally constellated. And as a matter of fact, I think there's a lot of research to support that idea. But I don't want to take away from where you were going, James, because I don't think that was quite the direction you were headed with it. I think you were trying to bridge the physics psychology gap, and then we got off into this territory of grouping people together. And it's okay. We don't have to agree about that particular point. Like, that's the whole art of conversation.
Yeah. So, I guess one thing that I thought was really interesting about, and this is more from, I guess, helped me at least get a better understanding of the proper domain in which to apply science, or how one can apply science. There's this idea that, so if you have a radioactive atom, then it will emit a particle and decay into, it'll emit energy and decay into a more stable state. What's interesting about this is that if you try and predict when this will happen for a single atom, it's impossible. But if you have a huge lump of these atoms together, you can determine the decay rate of the entire mass in a statistical. So the prediction becomes a statistical prediction or a probabilistic prediction. And so I guess the reason why I find this really interesting is because I usually thought of science as something being like, this is a very concrete, not psychic manifestation or a situation where one trying to predict the behavior of a single radioactive atom is actually not scientific at all, because it's impossible to predict it using scientific methods.
Wow.
And so what this did for me is that sort of helped me sort of, I guess, pull back a little bit from my previous, I guess, like scientific, atheist, rationalistic perspective on the world. And I really wasn't expecting to see that coming out of something like nuclear physics.
Wow. That's amazing. And when did you come out of that phase of your life, James, when you were
I think I kind of started. It's been a progression for me, and I think I'm kind of near the end of it. But I started probably about 5 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, because I think it really started when I read Sam Harris's book Waking Up, because that's when he talks about meditation and that sort of thing.
Right.
And, then I started getting into Ellen Watson,
Right.
more things like that. But yeah, anyways, I just thought that was a really interesting thing about. So if for those who are, I guess, hell bent on the scientific perspective, it's like even the scientific method can't be applied for everything in the physical universe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it keeps us humble, that's for sure. It's amazing. What's next? Oh, by the way, that was a good example of a complex.
Oh yeah? How
yeah.
so?
Not the one you just said, but the part about whether we can group people together based on situations. That fired up a complex. I was like, no, you can't. It's impossible.
Oh yeah.
So I was animated by the part of me I call the challenger and the philosopher who wants to, push ideas further. It's just interesting how these, again, they're not good or bad. They just are. They bring life to us. They bring energy to our system. It's just quite amazing to watch. All right, guys. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I'm good.
Yeah? What about you, James? Do you feel like we covered some good territory today?
Yeah.
I wish I had more to say about the physics thing, but I just it's not my wheelhouse. I don't How about, do you have any like psychological nuggets where like felt like for you in your personal life that the physics piece was with the Paul Jung letters was really helpful for you, or anything that is practical information?
Yeah. Actually, one thing that I thought was really interesting is that in a lot of Pauly's dreams, he has a lot of like physical terms or like things related to physics and mathematics in his dreams. And Jung brought up the point that the reason why Pauly had these images in his dreams was not because they necessarily represented something in physics, but it's because that was the language with which he's used to thinking about things in his everyday life, because, he spent all of his time doing physics and mathematics. So I think it might be helpful, like if anybody's interested in trying to understand their dreams, try and see if there are ways or like the language that your dream speaks to you is going to be in terms of things that you think about in your day-to-day life. And so I think understanding the context of which you understand things in the day-to-day life will help you understand your dreams. And so I thought that was something that was really interesting and useful, because I kind of started to try and approach my dreams from that perspective. I haven't gotten very far with it yet, but just also because I think about math a lot, trying to understand, if I see something mathematical in my dream, what does that mathematical term mean in like a conceptual sense? How do I think about it? How does it feel to me? That sort of thing.
Wow. That's really cool. Thanks, James. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this. When I had the idea, I was thinking, from all the Discord discussion we've had and previous conversations, I was just really impressed with your ability to think things through and the amount of reading that you had been doing. And I really was like, because I'm in these studies, I'm deep into these studies. I wanted a conversation partner that could help me further my own thinking, and also hopefully I can help you further your thinking.
Yeah.
And man, it's just, I hope maybe we can do this more often, because I've got these big exams coming up this summer, and to be able to kind of have a conversation partner talking about Jungian ideas is really helpful for me.
Yeah, this was really helpful for me too. And if you have some topics for your exams that you'd like to talk about, I'd definitely like to hear about it, because it's always good to talk about these things, and I always learn from it. So
how are you coming along in your PhD program?
Coming along pretty well. I think so. I talked to my advisor recently about when I would finish up, and we think probably in about 1.5 years or so.
Damn, dude. How old are you?
28.
Congratulations, man. You're killing it at a young age.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So, a mathematics PhD with a special interest in Jungian psychology. What an interesting combination.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, do you love math? Do you like nerd out?
Yeah, actually I do. Yeah,
really?
I like it quite a bit. Yeah.
That's awesome. And do you find that when you're reading Jung, you feel mathematically inclined to interpret his ideas through that lens?
Yeah, actually, sometimes some of his concepts I kind of find that so like the thing about thinking of an archetype as a probability distribution, like that totally made sense to me. Right when I read it, like I didn't have to think about it at all. It's like, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So just kind of things like that, I at least kind of visualize, maybe mathematically or geometrically. So
that's amazing, man. I'm so excited for you, and it's fun to be on this educational journey, kind of from afar, along each other's sides at the same time. Like,
yeah.
Like I'm going for the master's PhD in Jung. You're doing the math. It's kind of, I don't know. I just I like the connection we have going here. It's fun for me, and I know Mercury has shared. He's been enjoying these conversations too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you ever look into Donald Hoffman with any depth, James?
I heard a couple of his podcasts where he's talked about his ideas, about how reality as we experience it is sort of like this interface between us and the material substrate, or whatever you want to call it. So I've looked in. It's been a while since I've listened to any of this stuff, but yeah, I looked into it a little bit.
Yeah, because when I encountered that, I was immediately curious what you thought of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think I haven't thought about it a lot in a while, but when I heard it, it really made sense to me. Because it seems like a lot of people maybe make some, what I would consider a philosophical leap, where you assume that whatever you're interacting with is somehow like corresponds to, or is in some sense ultimate reality, that's like, or objective reality. But when he brought up this idea that he had, about what we experience, all of our experience is just an interface, and we don't really actually have access to objective reality. I thought that was really interesting, and I think I probably agree with it.
Yeah, and I found it really interesting. He said that came not from any philosophical pursuit, but like it came straight from the math of running game theory evolution. And just like that, it was coming straight from the math, and that it kind of blew his mind. But I found everything he said was easy for me to take, because that's exactly what I mean when I say that going crazy taught me that we're all hallucinating our realities. That even when we think like that, we have no idea what's really there. And all his way of putting it, where like, okay, just because it's an icon of a train and I don't know what's really there, doesn't mean you don't take it seriously. You just don't take it literally. The same way that you wouldn't drag an icon to a little trash bin, not because you think the trash bin's literally real. But yeah, that was what insanity just knocked me into. And that's the way I've been experiencing the world for like a decade now. And for me, it's phenomenological now because of the way insanity warps it. So it's like I see it happen. Where just that's the world I live in. He's described. That's how I see everything around me. But if you ever get curious and look more into the math of it, I'd love to hear what you have to think. And for anyone who's watched this far, I don't use the Discord, but Ryan's pointing out that you and he and a bunch of other excellent minds are active there.
I should share the link.
You should share the link. And
we like our Discord.
Yeah, and if anyone likes this and wants to ask James questions, you're around there sometimes, right, James?
Yeah, I pop on.
Trying to find
once in a while.
So this conversation can continue both, or people can leave comments underneath that I'm sure you guys will respond to. And there's the Discord, so other people who are studying this kind of thing and want to get more involved. Brian's going to leave a link.
There it is. It's in the chat. It's in the chat right now. And then I'll put it in the... Well, I think the chat's fine. Yeah, it's in the chat. Yeah, absolutely. Please join. Discord is a place where we all talk. It's a little chat area with different topics. It's really easy to navigate. You just click the different tabs for different conversations. We have... announcements, community, just shooting the shit. We have community creations where people can share things they're working on, requests for support, and then we have like these philosophy tabs where we talk about diet and nutrition. Then we have physicality training. We have all these different places where we can chat, so it's pretty cool.
I read through it sometimes, but I'm not active there at all.
Yeah, it's pretty
also
fun.
Before we wrap up, we should start saying if you guys like this kind of content, if you enjoyed this, like and share it. That makes a big difference. And even if you don't have anything to say, apparently commenting makes a big difference.
Sharing too. Sharing on Facebook or social media. Sharing on any social media is really helpful.
And even though I am not in the habit of doing this properly, like we do read all the comments and we appreciate the likes as well. So.
Awesome. Well, maybe next time, what I'd like to do next time we talk is pick up on this idea, just for the sake of furthering my own thinking and hopefully benefiting you guys as well, is to pick up on this idea of collective versus individual. James, you're well aware that this is a Discord topic that we've wrestled with in the past, and it's a never-ending stream of interesting obstacles and also insights, beautiful insights that happen within that conversation. Because I'd really like to push, what I'd really like to do is establish for me the position that I don't know if there is any 100% universality that we can actually say about the human psyche that is to the distinct level of a subpersonality. Not that, like, we can all say that we're breathing, right? We can all say that we have these different capacities, but when it comes down to it, can we really say that we share these things? And I would think that the answer is no, and I'd like to cite some of the research that supports that, but I'd also want to hear the other side of it, because I don't want to just be a one-way street with my ideas. I want to understand, even if you guys want to play devil's advocate, just for the sake of conversation and furthering the idea. So is that something you'd be open to?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like it'd be really interesting.
Yeah, cool. All right, everybody.
Sounds like fun.
All right, cool. All right, everyone. We'll be around. We'll be posting videos whenever we can. Love y'all. See ya.
Bye.
Yep, see ya.